Tim, how are you?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Awesome. Well, hey, man, thanks again for crafting time. It's always an honor to work with experts. And in your case, you are the master of a lot of trades. And so, obviously, you and I have connected a little bit in terms of where we are in the project. I was just letting the students know that you're aware of what we're doing and some of their work and all that good stuff. So I thought we'd start off first. I think it's important to kind of lay the landscape. I know it's always weird talking about ourselves, but if you could start off just introducing who you are, what you do, and I was even thinking about that question, what you do, that might be the whole session, but it's like two things. And then we'll kind of get into being able to use some of your expertise and insights so that these awesome students can become even more awesome when it comes to our exhibition.
Sure, of course. I do a bunch of things. So I'm an artist and I'm a teacher. So I teach at the high school and the college level. I also wrote a book. So I'm an author. I wrote a book on STEAM called STEAM Power. And in that book, I wanted to make sure I talked about why STEAM was important. So I interviewed a number of different professionals from NASA and different places. And then I also became a NASA Solar System Ambassador, which is about the coolest title you could have. I think it's pretty fun. So I work with NASA JPL out in California, the Jet Propulsion Lab. And I do a lot of work with them. I also work with Adobe and a lot of different design groups, things like National Geographic and things like that. So a little bit all over the place. I like to follow whatever my curiosities are. So it helps me kind of touch on lots of different things. So I've also worked as a journalist, and I write articles, and I do a lot of interviews with everyone ranging from actors and directors and stuff like that to musicians to, people that work in space and technology.
I love it. So you've got a lot of perspectives and insights, which is exactly what we need. That's part of our journey, obviously, not just, I should say, just creating solutions, but also opening up and expanding our own perspective of the world and thinking and people. And so one of the things that we're moving into is we're leaving prototype phase and moving into getting our final designs created, as well as starting then to figure out our arena, which is going to be their place to tell their story. And really they're going to be designing roughly two stories, however they want to weave that. One is their own learning journey story, how they went from very beginning to where they are. And then another story around their problem they've identified and their solution that they think will solve. So as we think about story in some of those categories, obviously feel free to take it any way you want to go, or if you want to start somewhere else. We're just trying to wrap our head around how do we start to tell compelling stories beyond, we've been preaching here time and time again, no one's going to have note cards, we're not doing a slide deck, we're getting away from the standard story mode. How do we get our audience to truly be engaged in this awesome work that they've been undergoing for a couple months?
Yeah, no, that's terrific, and I love that you're telling those two different stories. The story that of your own learning journey, and the story of what you're doing. So I'm a storyteller in lots of different ways. So I've worked in film, and I've written plays, and I've performed everything from stand-up comedy to like online stories where you go up on stage and we'll just tell a story. So I'm a big believer in not using note cards. I mean, sometimes I'll just write down a couple of key words that will help me kind of keep track of what I'm saying. But when you talk naturally, people are much more interested. So that's really important, to kind of be natural, be yourself. And everyone has different strengths in terms of telling stories. Some people are naturally funny, some people are naturally interesting, and a lot of information. Part of what you want to learn is a little bit of what your strengths are as a storyteller. And I find that when you guys are collaborating on some story elements, so it's going to be really important to also be on the same page with each other and make sure that everyone understands, the greater story. So one of the things I like to do is create story maps that actually visualize where the stories are going. So there's a couple different ways to do that. There's some kind of, we talk a lot about beginning, middle, and end, structure. And for the kind of thing that you're doing, problem solution is a really good fit. And then there's things that are going to make any story more interesting. Like, one of the things I like to do is just think of stories that you could remember, because if you remember them, they made an impact on you. So it doesn't matter whether it's just your uncle at Thanksgiving, or watching a TED Talk, and I've done a TED Talk, and one of the things with TED Talk that they really notice that they don't want you to write down notes, so they want you to talk like a person to other people, so it's more interesting. So there's something called a through line. So it's one element that kind of connects all of the other elements together, right? So because you guys are focusing on space, and you are focusing on some of the technology, it's going to be a little bit easier to understand your through line. You just want to make sure you kind of come back to the same point. So I think I also have a couple of slides I could share on some. Yeah, I'm a visual person because I'm an artist, so I always like to see whatever it is that I'm talking about, and that makes it much easier for me to remember. So that's one of the things that I like to do, is have some of those things. Visual elements do help, and kind of making cues as you're going through and telling stories. So there's certain things that you want to kind of touch on every single time you tell it, even if you naturally tell it a little bit differently.
Yeah, you should be able to share now too. No, there you go.
Perfect. Thank you. Cool. All right. So yes. So yeah, I mentioned my book and the stuff like that. I'd also mention one of the people I interviewed, Melody Yashar, works for NASA Ames, and she literally does some of what you guys are learning about. So like, she is creating 3D printing houses for Mars, for the NASA 3D printing challenges. So the first one she made was the Mars ice house. So this is a design that actually works. I actually made a model of it. So the ship would go there and then drill down and actually melt some of the ice and then refreeze it to actually create a 3D printed ice house where the people could live. So she's interesting to look at because she's actually tackled some of these issues. And then, she's done she actually has beat out the European Space Agency a few times in some of these 3D printing challenges for NASA. So in terms of story elements, the things that really will help a lot is learning. And I think that naturally, because all of you learn so much in doing this, that it'll be very easy to share some of the learning in your story. Drama, and I think that, from what I've heard about your project, there's definitely stakes, obviously, because you're having something happen on another planet. That's going to be obvious, so that there will be a sort of danger element along with adventure. That always makes for a great story. Surprise, you might want to think a little bit about what elements of surprise might actually help, especially as you're going through the story. It's nice to have some unexpected things happen. Whenever you could work humor into something, it always works. Interactivity. So it sounds like what you're planning is very participatory, so people will actually take part in it and actually be moving around. That's always going to be really interesting. And then the next one's really important, relatability. So especially when you're talking about space, a lot of people don't understand a lot of the elements. So you want to make sure that you relate it to a person that might not have the knowledge that you have. So you want to make sure that they could understand it in their own terms. So if you want to share with, your grandmother or your grandfather or something like that, and they don't know as much about all of the different elements, how would you tell them? So you want to consider some of those things. And then, of course, fun. I think, fun is something that is always going to be engaging and helpful.
Yes, Tim, not to interrupt you there, but
yeah,
back to that previous slide there real quick, because I know this is a part that I'm thinking out loud for myself. I can envision how awesome the exhibition is going to be. As we think about relatability, what are some ways to consider, I didn't know if you could expand on that, because one of the things we had written on the board is, how do we help people realize that these ideas about space actually matter about their life on Earth? And I know that's obviously some of the work we need to uncover, because you try to build those connections in, like your work, whether you're doing art or writing a book or a TED Talk, especially as you talk to people that maybe are not in STEM education and things like that, what's your thinking process to build that relatability piece? Because that's going to be a huge part for us. Yes, it can be enjoyable. It can be amazing. Parents and everybody will love their kids and work. But we also don't want it to just look like, yeah, that's kind of cute. We want them to realize, like, this is a thing. Like, this is the world. And I know that's the message we got to convey. But how do you do that through your mediums?
Yeah, so this is important, especially like when I give a talk as a NASA, solar system ambassador. One of the things that I'll often hear from people is, these projects in space cost so much money. Why do we do this? So it's important to understand like how it affects the average person. And one of the things I always share is, there's hundreds of everyday things that we use all the time that were created for the space program that you might not realize. So everything from like, Tang, the drink, which was popular back in the 70s and 80s, to a lot of the pens and, a big, piece of the iPhone. So like all of a lot of the components for your phone were created originally for space. So it's important to know that like, you're not just developing things for space, that you're actually developing things that actually improve our lives every day. So I think that's one way to kind of show some of the relatability. And then also like when you're designing, like we'll take the Mars ice house. So like when you're designing a habitat for another planet, those ideas also apply, of course, to habitats here on Earth. So, it does impact us every day. So a lot of the things that we build for space, are structurally sound and, cost effective. And that allows us to actually bring some of them here. Like 3D printing houses is something that actually happens almost everywhere now. So, you're able to 3D print a house much faster and it's much less expensive. So, those are two ways to think about making it relatable. And then also, there's a reality that, we're dealing with global warming and lots of issues here on planet Earth. And, at some point in the future, it would be very important for us to kind of colonize and have, an existence on multiple planets. So I think that's also a realistic thing, even though it might not be in my lifetime, it very well may be in your lifetime. So that's another kind of element you want to think about too. So a lot of those things help. One of the things that I always kind of tell my students to do is, when we are learning about things, sometimes just take a moment and think about how you relate to the things that you're learning about. So like, if you're working on, say the train in your project, a lot of those elements come from the designs that were started here on Earth, like the bullet train and things like that. So a lot of the things that, make space, existence possible also really help us here on the planet. So I think that's a really good start of thinking about that kind of relatability.
Perfect. Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt your next slide there, but it has some key points for us, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's super important. You need to make sure that everyone could find some way to relate to what you're doing, because you need them to care. So ultimately, what you want to do is like when people care about what you're talking about, they're going to be much more interested and invested. So I think everyone probably has had that experience in school. When you care about the subject, it's a lot more interesting. Yeah. So, when we talk about surprise, this was always an image that I like to use. So like this is the Eagle Nebula in space. And, when I talk about the different space telescopes, there's the visible light and the infrared light and how different it looks, but there's still that similarity. So, there's lots of things in space that you can kind of use to, kind of highlight that surprise factor. So I mentioned story mapping. So like this is a map that I like to use for a lot of stories. You start and you think about what do we need to know about to understand the story first. What elements about space do people need to know? And you make sure that you kind of lay that stuff out. Like, where are we? How did we get here? Why are we here? Those sort of elements. And then something happens to sort of trigger the story and set it in motion. And then you need to raise the stakes. So like, why does this matter to you? And, what do you have to win or lose? So, very likely, if we're talking about life on other planets, it's going to be survival. And then that moment of change where sort of things trigger, and then the resolution. So like, how are you different now? I always like to say a good story ends with, and we were never the same again. So this is a simple story map. And then this is how I actually map out stories with my classes. I'll use Post-it notes, and we'll have like the goals listed up on top, and then kind of break it down to the stories and the different elements of the stories, and then who's responsible for which element. So I find this really useful. Post-it notes are great for this kind of thing. When I wrote a book, it's hard to keep track of all of the stuff that you're doing. So like, each chapter had Post-it notes, and it's just a really good way of sort of organizing the story and making sure that you're hitting on those most important points, especially when you're collaborating with other people. It's kind of really essential. So also it's really helpful to have an arc in a story. So an arc is, like that kind of beginning, middle, end. So, a strong plot is always going to have, a couple different elements. You want to make sure you set things up well so that, the things that we need to know about, you want to make sure that everyone understands those things before you kind of set the story in motion too much. The tension, one of the things that we like in TV shows and films is tension. So like, you need to sort of like have some stakes, and then the climax. So like, just like any good story, you want to make sure the highest point of tension hits, and then there's that resolution. So, this is just a typical sort of story arc, and you could kind of, make it fit to what you're doing. So that's it on the slides. I just wanted to share some of those things with you because I thought they would be really helpful. I'm happy to help you guys in any way with your story. I think you're kind of just getting started on it from what I heard. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them to you.
Yeah, I'll start off with one, and I know these guys, they're not shy, so they'll ask me questions. But one of the things is because I think it's awesome to have someone like you to be able to speak from, because you live it. As we think about different mediums for our storytelling, all the students are going to be in character as their space crew, taking part in that narration. But as we think beyond just, I shouldn't say just, we've got our working solution, we've got to develop this story, we have our words, but we also are going to be in charge of our backdrops, our scenery, our props, to help make it feel more immersive. So what are some things that we might need to think about? I mean, I know you do you do all these things that I think we could get really caught up in how cool our costume looks, make sure our final product is working. But if all we're standing back, behind is a cylinder wall or cardboard, it doesn't feel the same. So how can you also tell your story through art or graphics or visuals, that you don't actually have to like highlight, point to, but it helps strengthen the storyline?
Yeah, that's so important. And there's movies like Star Wars that do such a good job at this. Star Wars was made from the original Star Wars movie. How many people had seen Star Wars? Let me just make sure. Okay, perfect. This is a good class. All right. So the original Star Wars movie didn't have a big budget. I mean, they were literally going to model shops and buying models of like battleships and then just gluing them together to make a lot of the stuff. So it was like really inexpensive. They didn't have money, and they were using a Volkswagen with a camera attached to it. So it's like, we're talking about, like less than even like, a low budget film today. But it looks really good. Even it holds up now. When you look at Star Wars, you don't say like, oh, those effects are terrible. It still looks pretty good. So what you want to do is you want to have a sense of detail, but it doesn't need to be totally accurate because it's in the background. So, if it's too plain, it's going to stand out and look, phony. So you need a layer of detail, but, one of the keys is to always just stand back 5 feet after you do something and to look at it from that perspective. So, this is something where when you're collaborating, it's a lot easier because you can have one person stand back a little bit and look at some of the backgrounds and get a better idea. So, even on films today, a lot of the background artists, you don't need everything to be perfect. It's not about perfection. It's about just creating a sense of detail. And that really makes a difference. So, sometimes less is more in terms of the backgrounds. Like, you might want to consider what you're capable of. So like, you're telling a story and you have a limited time amount. So, where do you want your best backgrounds to be? Like, where do people going to spend the most time? Those are some things you want to think about first, because you want to make sure you're investing in the right places. You know what I mean? Like, if there's an action element and people are going to be moving through it quickly, you don't need to have terrific backgrounds for that. But if they're going to spend some time there, you want to have some places for their eyes to look. And another thing is kind of picking some key points. Like, I've worked a lot in film. And one of the things that we'll do is we'll actually tape out on the floor where people are going to stand and go to. So you kind of want to have some, points that kind of people know to arrive at and tell parts of the story there. So you probably want to literally map out on the floor, maybe with this tape, where the important points to stand are, and then have nice backgrounds around those areas. You know what I mean? So like, it's really helpful. There's a play in New York City that's been going on for a couple of years now that all happens in a hotel. So you get in the ground floor and you go into the hotel, and as you go into each room, the story moves forward. And then, the story completes by the time you get to the top floor. So that's the kind of thing there, they know where they're going to be in the room. The story doesn't happen exactly the same way every time, and that's totally more interesting, to be honest. Sometimes nothing has to, you don't need a perfect script where you're going to hit the same exact note every single time. It's better to be casual and to have a original experience. So, you just want to have certain points that you're going to hit when you're telling the story. And make sure that those are the areas that you invest more time in the design and creative aspects.
Great insights there. Thank you, Tim. Question that you guys have. What are you guys thinking? What's on your mind? Are you thinking about your project? You're thinking about stories, stuff that he said maybe you want to expand upon? Yeah, go ahead.
What do you feel is the best way to remember things without note cards?
So, yeah, what I do is I write down just the words. You know what I mean? So like when I did my TED Talk, and then I try to edit it down so that I, maybe for a 10-minute talk, I might have 5 words. That's it. So like, it's just like kind of a memory thing. So like what I literally did is I used my hand and I wrote down the 5 words in my hand. And that way, and then I didn't actually, when it was time to perform, I didn't actually keep them on my hand. I washed my hands. But I just remembered, I would just think of finger 2, and that's, the word creativity, and finger 3, you know what I mean? So like I would kind of just memorize those important words. And then, I think it's also important to go with the flow. So, there's going to be some things that happen that are unexpected, or you might forget a piece, and it's okay to go back to it. It doesn't need to happen the same way twice. If you look, there's a terrific storytelling series called The Moth. So The Moth is all live stories told on stage. And I have done The Moth a couple times, and I have friends that do The Moth, and it's a podcast. And, they actually go into schools and actually work with students just to tell like real life stories. So it's all real life stories. And one of the things you find is that, people's personalities are really important. There's some people that are a little bit shy. There's some people that are more outgoing. So you play to your strength, whatever that is. And I think that it helps a lot.
Yeah, so Tim, something that I want to build upon. I think you hit something that's really important. I think in our brains, we think we have to have memorized lines, almost be robotic. So, that's just sometimes how school trains us. We got to just, boom, boom, boom. But you keep saying, go with the flow and just be yourself, which I love, and I'm so glad you brought that up. But I think there's another layer, and I'm curious on your thoughts. Some point, all of these students here are going to experience a question from a participant that they don't know the answer to. And it's human nature to act like you know everything.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit, I don't, maybe this isn't even the right phrase about this, of like giving ourselves permission to say, I don't know, but that's a really great question, because it's going to happen. And I think sometimes that's where we get stuck. We try to just start blabbing and hoping that an answer will come. And then now all of a sudden we're more stressed if we're worried about the next person to come through versus going, hey, that's a good question. I don't know. And then, you know, do you talk about that on stage kind of in the moment, or because that it's going to happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great question. I think that's really important. Yeah. And I think that just from what I've learned about your project, all of you have learned a lot. You're all very knowledgeable about this stuff. So you totally need to give yourself permission to not know some of the answers. And there's a couple of kind of helpful tricks to deal with that. One of them, you know, I did improv comedy, which is where you go on stage and you actually have no ideas. You just ask the audience for one word, and then you make up a whole story based on it, and then you start acting it out. So it's really challenging, but it was really, really helpful. And they have this idea called yes and, right? So like whatever someone says, you just want to help them. And it's really collaboratory, and you want people to help each other. So sometimes if you don't know an answer, you know, it's okay to, you know, hand it off to somebody else. And like, I have no idea, you know, maybe Sally knows. And like, you know, it gives you an option of an out, and that really helps. You know, or, you know, if you don't know an answer, you could also kind of investigate the answer in the moment. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, but maybe we could figure it out, you know, like that kind of thing. So, you know, when you don't know, the one thing you don't want to do is make stuff up, because that just it goes down a dark hole quickly. So that's the one thing. And I learned that early. I had an ant farm in like second grade, you know, for a science fair, and someone asked me a question. I had no idea. I started making stuff up, and then I had no idea what I was even talking about. So like it you know, it goes bad quickly. So you absolutely, whatever you do, you know, keep it honest. And you know, what would you actually do if you don't know something is a good way to kind of do, like, you know, think about some of those options. That would be a good way to work on it.
Thank you. Other questions you guys have, or wonderings, or tips or advice you would like to have from Tim? You guys aren't usually this quiet. What are you wondering about? What are you thinking about? Maybe not a question. What are some thoughts in your head that might trigger some ideas in conversation with Tim? He's giving you lots of stuff. You guys are churning out notes like crazy. All right, so notes are great, but if we don't move them into action, why are we taking notes too, right? So what are we thinking? Let's just kind of word vomit some ideas out loud. Yeah.
So I was just gonna say, can you tell me more about like what you do with NASA?
I didn't catch the end of that. What was that?
She just wants to know what you do more. She wants to know more about what you do in NASA. Like, what exactly is a solar system ambassador?
Yeah, no, it's super cool. Let me tell you, like, I always was into space since I was a little kid. So being able to work for NASA is like kind of amazing. So as a solar system ambassador, I had to get trained. And then what I do is like I work with NASA, and they'll share all this information about their missions with me. And my job is really just to go out and share with people like you. So, you know, I end up learning tons, like, you know, next month, actually later, well, it's November. It's almost December. Yeah. So next month, you know, you have like the Charles Webb telescope coming out, you know, so I learned all of this information about the Charles Webb telescope, and, you know, why it's better than the Hubble and things like that. And I'll go out and share it with people, everything from like libraries and, you know, classes to, you know, small groups of people, and you know, we'll go to like astronomy programs and stuff like that. So it's really nice because you get to interact. Like I get to go to the NASA buildings and see some of what they're doing, and like, you know, I have friends that worked on the Mars rover and stuff like that. So it's just super interesting. Like, you know, in the course of all of my stuff, I've gotten to meet people like Elon Musk and talk to him, and sort of see some of like, you know, what they're doing at SpaceX. I have a friend that just went to space this year. So she was one of the first non-astronauts to ever go into space, which is pretty cool. So I get to just share, you know, interesting stuff about space and help people. So sometimes that's, we had like the lunar eclipse recently, and like, we'll share how you could photograph that, or it could just be like space programs and things like that. So it's a little bit of everything, but it's super interesting, and there's a whole network of them. But if you continue and you're still interested in space, it's the kind of thing that even starting at college, you could apply for, and then you get like, you'll actually get a NASA pass, and you get options to go and visit some of the NASA buildings. And one thing I will say is that NASA does hire lots and lots of people. One of the things that I liked that I found out is that they literally hire artists, right? I was always an artist, and I wouldn't think that would happen. But they hire artists as creative technologists. So like, when the new space telescope comes out, it's folded up like origami, and the artists help them figure out how to fold it up using these old origami methods that will then open up in space over the course of a month. So, everything from like chefs, because they can't have any crumbs on board. So they have to have crumbless food. There's jobs in all different kind of areas. So it's super interesting.
That's awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
What was your TED Talk about?
My TED Talk was about creativity. So I wanted to talk about failure. Sometimes like we have a stigma about failure, and I think that failure is the best way to learn. Like, when you make mistakes, if you continue persevering, it's not really failure, it's just learning. So one of the things that people I think get afraid of is like, I don't know how to draw, or I don't know how to paint, or I don't know how to do this. And I always tell people to like, no, just dive in. If you don't know, that's total freedom. You're not expected to be good at it right away. That's how you learn. So that was the idea. And it was supposed to be in front of a big group of people, and then the pandemic happened. So I did it in my kitchen. So it was a good example of, making things work creatively that way.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, go ahead.
What actors did he interview?
He wanted to hear.
Oh, yeah.
What actors you've interviewed or spoke with?
I've been super lucky. Like, this is ridiculous. So I started interviewing people when I was in college because I wanted to, I was a photographer, and I wanted to be able to photograph them. So I didn't really know what I was doing. I just, I found that you can get a pass and do it. So I started my own zine, which is just a photocopied magazine. And I started interviewing people that way. And then I just continued doing it for blogs. So a couple of like notable people are like Carrie Fisher, who is Princess Leia. So she was really, really cool. And that was one of my first big interviews. And she liked the interview, so she shared it on social media, and that opened the door. So I think there's a couple clips online of my interview with James Franco, and people like Jonah Hill, Bruce Springsteen. It's been pretty cool. Like, I think I've done about 100 interviews with different people. So like, Oscar winners and directors, and lots of people from like NASA and technology. So like Elon Musk was obviously a really cool one. And it's always really interesting because I think that interviewing is a skill itself too. So it was like a free college class because I got to learn so much from asking people these questions all the time. So I got to interview the guy that wrote Star Wars Empire Strikes Back and some of the big movies. So like, he's not a really famous person in everyday life, but I love those movies. So it was a really notable writer. So it's just really, really cool. It's a fun thing to do for sure. Always really interesting.
So earlier you were talking about like when writing a story, you want to be able to connect all the elements together. Is there a way to do that easily? The elements you're trying to connect to.
Were you able to hear that?
No.
You want to say it again, because you'll phrase it better than I will try to put words in your mouth. You just speak a little louder so you can hear.
So earlier you were talking about how you want to be able to connect all the elements in the story. So is there an easy way to do that, even if the elements you're trying to connect seem unrelated?
So I lost you. Just connect all the elements. Is there an easy way to do that? And then I missed.
Yeah. So is there an easy way to do that when the elements don't feel like they're related?
Oh, how to find a way to make them work. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a little bit like a puzzle. that might not fit sometimes. Sometimes you need to find the piece in between the pieces. So yeah, that is totally and this is the creative thing. So like, when you write movies, and I've had students like I've written movies and I've written TV shows, and I've had a lot of my students go on to do that. One of the things we do is we have these big brainstorming sessions, and there's a couple different models, and one of the models is just throwing out lots of ideas, and they could be good ideas and bad ideas. The idea is not to judge them, just kind of throw out like, every idea that you can possibly think of to tie things together. And all of those ideas kind of like marinate. You let them sit for a little bit, and then that's a pretty good problem solving technique. Like that helps a lot. And then also just, also thinking in terms of what do these things have in common? When you need to bridge two things. So like, in film, there's a couple tricks people use to kind of get from one place to another. So there's like a montage is a famous one where, you tell, rather than actually tell the story, you kind of show lots of pictures of what's happening in between. So there's some devices, is what we call in storytelling, that will get you from one thing to another. Right. So like, if you can't figure out how to get these two elements connected, that might be a good place for one of those things that I showed you that help on a story. So it might be a good place for humor. It might be a good place for a surprise. Like for instance, it's like, if you can't figure out how to get from the train to like the habitat or something like that, that's a good place for, one of those kind of surprise elements. Especially if you're on another planet, that makes it pretty easy because there's some actual things that could be surprises that happen there all the time. So that always helps.
Great question. Other questions? What about from you two in the back? Any questions you guys have from your perspective and lens? It's always good to put the adults on the spot. Just they don't like it, but I do it every time.
I think, I'm a little struggling with the story. Like, how do we, we're under a time crunch. And so how do we help them? Most people, we've got the Post-its, and you've given us some great strategies, a brainstorming session, just wrestling with that in my own brain.
I don't know if were you able to hear that okay, Tim?
Yeah, but mostly, I think I got the gist of what you were asking. Yeah, I mean, I think, because it's like what you're really, the way to think of what you're doing is probably think about it like a play, because you're actually acting out parts. Do you know what I mean? Like, because everyone has these different roles, and you're all playing parts. So in terms of creating the story for that, I always have a couple rules. Like, it's always good to start big and end big. Those are the things that people remember the most. And then you need kind of like certain points in the middle to make sure that people are paying attention, right? So you want your surprise moment, usually like it, in film and in class, people will usually give you 15 minutes. So it's like, it's hard to get to 15 minutes. Like, so like, every 5 minutes you want something kind of important to happen to keep the audience with you all the time. So, I mean, that's one way to sort of like lay it out, is you want to make sure that like every 5 minutes or so you have some action happening to move things along. There's something that we say in film, which is that even if you love something and it's one of your favorite parts, if it doesn't move the story along, it shouldn't be there. So that's always really helpful. And that's why you have, deleted scenes that sometimes are really funny or sometimes really interesting, and they just didn't work for the story.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, Chase.
What motivates you when you're at a stuck point? Because you have so many different problems, or different solutions. What's your main go-to?
Yeah, sometimes it's important to actually do something totally different. This is going to sound like it might not make sense, but like sometimes when you focus too much on a problem, it makes it harder to find a solution. and you need to do something totally different. Like I like to just, if I really get stuck, I just leave my cell phone at home and I take a 5-minute walk outside, and that will help you. Like there's a reason that a lot of famous people who have come up with great ideas have their best ideas in the shower or while driving or while taking a walk. It's because, you're not putting that pressure on yourself. One thing that's really important is that when you're doing something creative, pressure is going to make it much more difficult to actually achieve anything. So you need to sometimes relieve yourself of that pressure and give yourself a break in order to move forward and find a solution. Because sometimes it's, you end up doing something different for a little while, and then that helps you figure out the way to solve the problem. So that's one thing to know is like, don't push yourself too hard when you're trying to find some of these solutions. You need to actually take a break every once in a while. And then in terms of motivation, I think of the overall experience. I think one of the things all of you should think about is like, imagine going through this experience yourself and like, what would you want to happen? Like, what would you enjoy? What would you find fun? What would you find interesting? You could only know yourself. So like, think about what you would enjoy going through it. So imagine yourself in that situation where you're the person that's actually going through this experience. It's good to kind of empathize with the audience and imagine what they're going through. And what you think is funny and what you think is interesting. So like, think of that.
Any final thoughts? Make sure we're respectful of Tim's time here. This has been a wonderful opportunity, but I don't want to leave any thoughts on the table or in our brains. Awesome, Tim. Man, this has been super helpful and incredible, and also inspiring. Just the work that you do. You live and breathe your work, and I know it's resonated with us as the adults as well as the students as we start to face the time crunch here to make all this stuff come to life and make it happen for the people come. So this has been really great. It's for us to we're going to debrief after this, put our heads down and make some magic happen, and then actually bring it out to the 3D world. So this has been really, really helpful. So I can't thank you enough for making some time for us.
Of course, it's such a cool project. I can't wait to see what you guys do.
Yes, we'll definitely share with you once we get into that level of awesomeness.
Awesome. Well, best of luck, guys. It's a pleasure.
Anytime. Thanks, Tim. I'll follow up with you some point here and touch base about things. So
Sure, sounds good.
all right, man. Thank you again. I appreciate it.
I love the shirt too. That's awesome.
Yeah, a little Star Wars. I know.
Thematic. I love it.
Everything's just Star Wars. I'm like, yeah.
That's great. Take it easy, guys. Have a good one.
Yep. Bye-bye.